Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a really important subject, the historical relationship between Indigenous peoples and corporate Canada and the ongoing journey of reconciliation.
It's a huge topic, and one with incredibly deep roots.
Absolutely. Our main guide here is the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's Call to Action 92, which, specifically talks about corporate reconciliation.
But we're also drawing on a lot of material that looks at the whole picture from pre-contact Indigenous societies right up to the challenges businesses face today.
Exactly. So our mission really is to pull out the key insights for you, give you a clear sense of this complex history and why it matters so much for companies, well, right now.
And it's fascinating, isn't it, thinking about how these interactions started. It wasn't just with Europeans showing up. There were already these intricate systems.
Right. Let's dig into that. Before contact, Indigenous nations had these vast trade networks stretching across the continent.
Yeah, trading all sorts of things. Furs, food, tools, even textiles.
But it wasn't just about swapping goods, was it? There was more to it.
Oh, much more. These weren't just markets, they were complex economic and diplomatic webs. Establishing trade often involved specific ceremonies, negotiations.
Focused on what? Like fairness?
Fairness, yes, but also reciprocity, and really cementing the relationship itself. It was about building trust and connections between different nations, not just the transaction.
And supporting all this were sophisticated governance systems, different across the board.
Totally diverse. First Nations governance could involve hereditary chiefs or complex consensus building in communities, always with this sense of shared responsibility.
And the Inuit.
For the Inuit in the Arctic, governance was deeply tied to oral traditions, storytelling, the wisdom of elders guiding community decisions, very adapted to their environment.
And the Métis.
The Métis, with their unique blended heritage, often built governance around community and kinship, especially clear during things like their annual harvesting season gatherings.
And underpinning all of these systems was this deep connection to the land, right? Stewardship.
Absolutely central. You see really sophisticated sustainable practices, things like rotational hunting, careful resource management by First Nations.
Ensuring things lasted.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Inuit hunting practices showed deep respect for the Arctic's balance, and the Métis blended traditional knowledge with new techniques. It was all about long-term health of the land.
Okay, so into this established world comes European expansion, and the fur trade becomes this massive catalyst for change.
It really was a turning point. Initially, you had partnerships, Indigenous knowledge of the land, trapping, trade routes. It was essential. And European goods were, well, attractive.
But that partnership dynamic shifted.
It did. As European demand for furs exploded, the power balance tilted. European traders and settlers started dictating terms which profoundly altered Indigenous economies and, traditional power structures.
And this period also saw the first treaties and alliances, pitched as ways to coexist peacefully.
That was often the language, yes. But the reality was usually quite different. There was often a fundamental lack of understanding, different concepts of sovereignty, land.
And a power imbalance.
A huge power imbalance favoring the crown. Colonial interests usually came first, and promises made to Indigenous nations were often misinterpreted or just ignored. It set a difficult precedent.
But there was one key document, the Royal Proclamation of 1763, that tried to set some ground rules for land.
Yes, the Royal Proclamation is really significant. It recognized existing Indigenous land rights, which was huge. And it set up a process for the Crown to acquire land needing consent through treaties.
So it laid a legal foundation.
It did. A basis for treaty making, and it still informs legal ideas today, especially around free, prior, and informed consent. It acknowledged, in theory anyway, that the land wasn't just empty or free for the taking.
But the numbered treaties that followed, across Western Canada, they often didn't live up to that spirit, did they?
That's the tragic reality. The stated intent might have been about rights and benefits, protecting ways of life, but the implementation, it often led to massive land dispossession, erosion of sovereignty.
Creating grievances that are still felt.
Deeply felt. The power dynamics in those negotiations were heavily skewed.
And the Métis faced their own specific form of dispossession with the scrip system.
Yeah, the scrip programs were officially meant to extinguish Métis land title, but the way they worked, often disastrous.
How so?
It was complex, poorly explained, and really open to manipulation by speculators. Many Métis were pressured or tricked into taking scrip, basically paper IOUs worth far less than their land.
Resulting in huge territory loss.
Exactly, undermining their whole cultural and economic base.
Then comes the Indian Act of 1876. This piece of legislation looms large.
It's hard to overstate its impact. The Indian Act gave the federal government staggering control over almost every single aspect of Indigenous life.
Designed for assimilation.
Explicitly, it gave Ottawa power over governance, land, education, culture, even banning vital ceremonies like the potlatch and the Sundance, things central to Indigenous societies.
And tied into this assimilationist agenda was the residential school system.
A devastating chapter. The clear goal was to eradicate Indigenous cultures, languages, spirituality by forcibly removing children.
The conditions.
Horrific. Abuse was widespread, identities suppressed. The intergenerational trauma from that system is still profoundly impacting communities today.
And that pattern of removing children didn't end with residential schools. We have the 60s scoop and even more recently, the Millennium scoop.
Yes. These were periods where child welfare systems, still driven by assimilationist ideas, removed huge numbers of Indigenous children, placing them in non-Indigenous homes.
Leading to loss of identity.
A devastating loss of cultural identity, connection, and compounding that intergenerational trauma.
It's such a history of systemic injustice. Were there moments where Indigenous resistance really started to push back effectively?
Oh, absolutely. The White Paper in 1969 was a pivotal moment.
What was that?
It was a government proposal to basically eliminate the distinct legal status of Indigenous peoples, get rid of the Indian Act, absorb everyone.
Another assimilation attempt.
Exactly how it was seen. And it was met with fierce, unified resistance from Indigenous leaders across Canada. Groups like the National Indian Brotherhood were crucial.
And the government backed down.
They did. They withdrew the White Paper. It was a major victory and a powerful assertion of the demand for self-determination.
And then in 1990, the Oka crisis. Very different, centered on land rights.
Yes. Oka started with a dispute in Kanisatak, a Mohawk community. The town of Oka wanted to expand a golf course onto land the Mohawk considered sacred, including a burial ground.
And the community resisted.
They did, blockading the land. It escalated into a tense standoff, got national and international attention, became this potent symbol of Indigenous sovereignty, and those deep unresolved land issues really brought it into the mainstream consciousness.
So following these moments in decades of activism, we see this growing, maybe slow, but growing recognition of the need for reconciliation. RCAP in 1996 was a big step.
The Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, yeah. RCAP was hugely influential. Its final report was massive, detailing the history, the present issues,
And recommending changes.
wide-ranging recommendations, calling for a whole new relationship based on recognizing Indigenous rights, self-determination, justice. It really set the stage for a lot of the reconciliation talk that followed.
And then, of course, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission from 2008 to 2015. Monumental.
Absolutely. The TRC's work documenting the residential school horrors, mainly through survivor testimonies, was essential, just bringing that truth out.
But it wasn't just about documenting the past.
No, crucially, it proposed solutions. The 94 calls to action, a concrete roadmap for reconciliation across all parts of Canadian society.
Including Call to Action 92, aimed squarely at the corporate sector.
Exactly. Which brings us to the present day, the ongoing challenges, and how corporate responsibility fits into all this.
One stark reality is the crisis of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, MMIWG.
It's a national tragedy, and it's absolutely crucial to understand its roots in colonial legacies, systemic violence, discrimination, marginalization.
And corporations have a role.
A significant role. Not just charity, but examining their own practices, creating safe workplaces, advocating for systemic change to address the root causes.
Another critical area.
Yeah.
The overrepresentation of Indigenous people in the justice system.
Yeah, the statistics are appalling. It's driven by factors like overpolicing, underprotection, systemic bias, and the socioeconomic marginalization that stems from colonialism.
So what can businesses do?
Be aware, firstly. Support initiatives for restorative justice, address bias, advocate for equitable treatment.
Healthcare is another area with major inequities.
Definitely. Systemic racism, access barriers, lack of culturally safe care. It's all linked to historical marginalization and the undermining of traditional Indigenous health systems.
Corporations can potentially help here too.
By investing in Indigenous-led health initiatives, supporting cultural safety training, advocating for equitable access policies.
And sadly, the issues in child welfare persist. Indigenous kids are still vastly overrepresented in care.
It's a direct, painful continuation of those historical removal policies, residential schools, the 60 scoop, The cycle continues.
Corporate support could focus on
Supporting Indigenous-led family preservation programs, cultural connection initiatives, addressing the root causes that lead to apprehension in the first place, trying to break that cycle.
We also see the impact of forced relocations, often due to development projects.
Yes, communities moved off their traditional territories, often without proper consultation or consent. It severs connections, disrupts lives, culture, everything.
Highlighting the need for
Meaningful consultation, free, prior, and informed consent, FPIC, and equitable benefit sharing. Absolutely essential.
and environmental racism is closely linked to this. Indigenous lands often bear the brunt of industrial impacts.
There's a clear pattern. Corporations need genuine consultation on environmental impacts, respect for Indigenous rights and traditional ecological knowledge, and a commitment to real stewardship.
Let's not forget urban Indigenous experiences either. It's complex.
Increasingly important. Many Indigenous people live in cities, facing unique challenges around identity, socioeconomic issues, accessing services, but also showing incredible resilience and building strong communities.
So support needs to be there too.
Yes, through targeted employment, partnerships with urban Indigenous groups, creating inclusive spaces.
And finally, recognizing Two-Spirit roles and addressing the challenges faced by Two-Spirit and LGBTQ plus Indigenous people.
Historically, Two-Spirit people often held respected roles. Today, they can face intersecting discrimination. Corporate inclusivity needs to actively recognize and support them.
Okay, so looking forward, what are the key principles for corporations wanting to genuinely engage in reconciliation?
Well, first off, actively recognizing and supporting Indigenous economic strength, fostering entrepreneurship, creating real partnerships, access to capital.
And the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, is fundamental now, especially since Canada adopted it. Can you remind us what that really means?
Sure. UNDIP outlines the rights of Indigenous peoples globally: self-determination, land rights, culture. Its core purpose is a framework for justice and respect. And a key principle is free, prior, and informed consent, or FPIC.
Meaning consent before projects happen.
Exactly. Before projects affecting their lands or rights begin, based on full information without pressure.
And linked to that is the duty to consult and accommodate.
Yes. A legal duty for governments, and increasingly corporations, to engage meaningfully with Indigenous communities about projects impacting their rights, and to accommodate concerns. It's more than just telling them, it's dialogue and adjustment.
Modern treaties and land claims offer another way forward beyond the Indian Act.
Right. These negotiated agreements provide frameworks for self-governance, resource sharing, economic development, a more contemporary basis for the relationship.
There's also a need to respect Indigenous legal traditions.
Absolutely. Integrating Indigenous approaches, which often focus on restorative justice and community healing, could make the Canadian system more just and effective for Indigenous people. Supporting their justice initiatives is key.
And understanding the legal history, like landmark cases, Delgamuukw and Suquoden.
Crucial context. These cases affirmed Aboriginal title and rights, impacting how corporations must operate on Indigenous lands. Delgamuukw established title as a communal right, so Quoten clarified it includes exclusive use.
We're also hearing more about Indigenous inclusion in corporate governance.
Vital. Having Indigenous voices at the top levels ensures their perspectives are considered, aligning business practices better with reconciliation.
And the calls for policing and justice reform remain urgent.
Definitely. Reforms addressing systemic racism, boosting representation, supporting Indigenous-led restorative justice, it's all critical.
What about intellectual property and cultural appropriation? A tricky area.
Extremely. Protecting traditional knowledge and cultural expressions is paramount. Corporations need ethical protocols, ensuring consent and recognition, not just exploitation.
Seems like cultural competency and anti-racism training is a basic requirement now.
Foundational, really. Educating employees about histories, cultures, ongoing impacts of colonialism helps dismantle stereotypes and build respect.
And TRC, Call to Action 92 itself, gives corporations a clear mandate.
It does. Adopt UNDRP, apply its principles to policies and operations, build respectful relationships, get FPIC, ensure equitable benefits, and report publicly on progress.
Frameworks like Reconciliation Action Plans, RAPs, or the CCA's PRR program can help structure this.
Yes, they offer practical guidance, tools for companies to develop, implement, and track their efforts. Helps move beyond just statements to concrete action.
Investing in Indigenous education and training seems like a direct way to support capacity.
Hugely important. Scholarships, internships, partnerships with Indigenous institutions. It empowers individuals and communities, helps build economic self-determination.
And Indigenous procurement, it needs to be authentic.
More than just ticking a box. It means fair processes, actively seeking Indigenous suppliers, understanding your businesses, building long-term, mutually beneficial relationships, contributing to the Indigenous economy.
Even land acknowledgments, they need substance behind them.
Right. They're an important first step, acknowledging whose traditional territory you're on, but they must be followed by real action, relationship building, tangible support.
And engaging elders and knowledge keepers requires real respect.
Absolutely. Humility, respecting protocols, valuing their wisdom, offering proper honoraria, creating comfortable spaces for meaningful exchange.
Finally, to make sure this isn't just talk, we need metrics, KPIs.
Essential for accountability. Clear, measurable indicators developed with Indigenous communities focused on tracking real progress and meaningful outcomes.
So as we wrap up this deep dive,
Mhm.
it's been a journey through a complex and often painful history, but also towards potential paths forward for reconciliation between Indigenous peoples and corporate Canada.
It really has.
Let's leave our listeners with this thought. Considering everything we've discussed, the deep history, the ongoing challenges, the principles for moving forward, how can genuine respect, real collaboration, and the recognition of Indigenous sovereignty truly transform things? How can it not only address past wrongs, but actually build a shared, equitable prosperity for everyone in Canada?
A powerful question to reflect on.
Think about what specific actions or ideas resonated most with you today, and how they might influence your perspective on corporate responsibility and, really, the kind of future we want to build. Thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive.